Okay. So this morning, I posted our final homework assignment, which I'm going to pull up here. And there it is. All right, so this one's a little bit different. It is yet another writing assignment. I know you're all working on your final projects also. But the deal with this one is, I mean, you can kind of see the brief here. You're pretending that you're working for a pipeline company, and you're trying to get a hydrogen pipeline permitted to bring hydrogen from West Texas to the Houston area. And the problem is that the pipeline is going to cross Comal County, which is where New Braunfels is, which is an environmentally sensitive area because it's a recharge zone for the Edwards Aquifer, and also Schlitterbahn is there. So you have to, the problem statement here, there's some background information. The problem statement is that you're going to write two different types of persuasive writing about this pipeline. One of them is going to be an environmental impact statement that would be submitted with the pipeline permit application to FERC, which is, we'll talk about what FERC is in a minute, but they're the federal agency that's responsible for infrastructure permitting. Then you are also going to write a 500-word op-ed for the local newspaper trying to convince people to be supportive of this infrastructure project. Okay, so it's writing for two different audiences. And so to prepare you for this, I have a short, where is my mouse? There it is. I have a short communications and broader impacts lecture here, where I'm going to give you some best practices about how to go about this task. Being able to communicate and persuade and engage with the community is an important part of low carbon energy, because a lot of the decarbonization efforts and low carbon energy that we've talked about require new infrastructure to be built in places that maybe haven't seen historically a lot of energy projects. And so having good community engagement from the outset of your project is really key. Actually, we'll see how this can go wrong in our next unit on nuclear energy. So you want to make sure you get it good, you get it right from the start, because a lot of the time, if you don't get it right from the start, there's no recovery. So this is an important thing to know how to do. Okay, so here's the problem statement. So this is another one of these maps of wholesale electricity prices in the ERCOT service area. And this was, let's see, I think I pulled this on October 27th of 2022. This was a day kind of like yesterday where it was hot and windy. And so the key here is that there was a lot of wind energy being generated in West Texas. And there was, so much being generated that in a lot of places, the electricity was being sold at a loss. They were negative prices. Basically paying people, they would pay people to take their electrons away if they could. Meanwhile, over here in the Houston area, it was hot. People were trying to run their air conditioners, and they needed that electricity. And so the problem is, if you have a lot of electricity being generated in West Texas and a lot of demand in Southeast Texas, we don't have enough transmission infrastructure to move that electricity from where it's being generated to where it's needed. And here's a kind of snarky tweet from Dr. Weber, just saying, gee, if only there was some way to move that electricity. So there's been a lot of attention recently on building more transmission infrastructure within Texas, both for gas products and for electricity, precisely because of this problem. Okay, so one of the issues, and we're talking about this right now in our methane emissions unit, is that in the Permian Basin, people are trying to produce oil because that's more valuable. And there's the associated gas that comes out along with the oil that you need to do something with. And so if you don't have a way to get that to market and have somebody who's actually going to buy it, you're just going to flare it. Okay. So, but at the same time, the United States has become the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. So if there was some way to get all this associated gas being produced in West Texas to the coast, where we've got, several LNG facilities now, then you could potentially sell that product and not have to flare it. Okay, so we have some recently completed pipelines that do just that, and these have actually alleviated a lot of the pressures on West Texas. There's been a measurable reduction in the amount of flaring because of that. But all these pipelines, this is infrastructure that gets built through people's property, and you have to get them on board to be able to do that. A similar thing is happening in Europe, that they really want to beef up their hydrogen economy. But to do that, they need to build a whole bunch of different pipelines for all the reasons we discussed in the hydrogen unit. It's not possible to simply repurpose existing natural gas pipelines. So they've got all these ambitious goals of, these are proposed new pipelines that they're looking at here to move the hydrogen around Europe. You've got to have a way of getting people on board with new pipeline construction. And finally, this is a good quote here, just kind of hammering home this point. If the United States is going to completely decarbonize its energy production, we need to triple electricity transmission infrastructure. So we need 3x what we have right now. And again, that's all construction and infrastructure that needs to be dealt with. Okay, so the point here is that to have sustainable energy, we need a lot more infrastructure that either needs to be built or upgraded. And this requires two things. A, you got to get permits for it. Okay, you have to convince government agencies that you're going to do a good job with what you're doing. And then the other thing is convincing local stakeholders that they can be on board with these projects. So that's really the two audiences that you have to think about when you're writing persuasively to get these projects moving forward. And so you have to think there's some very different ways of communicating between these two different audiences. Okay, so if you are writing a permit application to a government agency, it needs to be concise. Okay, people at the government agency are not going to want to be reading a whole bunch of words. They're busy people. They want to read a very concise version of what you're doing. They typically are going to follow a very strictly prescribed format, and you have to make sure you tick all those boxes. Now, I deal with this a lot in my job, because when I apply for a grant from the Department of Energy, for example, they say you must answer the following bullet points in your proposal, or else it'll be rejected without review. And they'll give you like 10 different things you have to do. And sure enough, if you mess up on one of them, you're out. So, they take this seriously. You need to make sure you tick all the boxes. And specifically for infrastructure projects, it's very important to convince them that you have done the risk assessment. Okay, what are the risks? How are you going to mitigate those two things? Okay, so that's kind of the very formulaic, concise way of writing to a government agency. Now, on the other hand, when you're writing to stakeholders, so this would be people like property owners and people in the local community and that sort of thing, you are writing to persuade them that what you're doing is worthwhile and valuable, and they feel comfortable putting their support behind it. So you need to persuade. You need to be very careful about your messaging and your phrasing. So pick a few key messages in a small amount of phrases. Don't go crazy with the wording. Okay, people want things, little bite-sized pieces that they can remember. And like I was saying, you want to make them feel comfortable that they can get behind what you're doing. Okay, so there's various ways of doing that, but that's generally the way you want to write to stakeholders. It's very different. Okay, so this is a little bit of a wordy slide, but it's a little bit of background on how infrastructure permitting works here in the United States. So there's this thing called NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, and that specifies how infrastructure permitting is done. And so the key thing here is that any federal agency that is that you would submit this infrastructure permitting to, there are two statements that you have to make. You have to write one called an environmental impact statement and another one called an environmental assessment. Okay, so those two statements are prescribed. You have to write those. But it's left up to the different federal agencies to determine how you go about meeting those requirements. Okay, so for energy infrastructure, the regulatory body that oversees this is called FERC. It's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they operate within the Department of Energy, but they are largely independent from it, just to avoid conflict of interest. And the things that they regulate include interstate oil and gas pipelines. So these are oil and gas pipelines that go from one state to another, okay? Intrastate pipelines that only stay within the state are regulated by the state. So in Texas, it is the Railroad Commission, I believe, who regulates the intrastate pipelines. But FERC is interstate pipelines. And FERC came up with their own guidelines for following NEPA and having the environmental impact statement and the environmental assessment, okay? And so these are their guidelines. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of them that you have to hit. And so to comply with NEPA, first of all, you need to make sure that you're communicating with the stakeholders. You have to show that you're doing that. And then you have to provide a whole bunch of resource reports on these various environmental and social and cultural aspects of what you're doing. So it's a very lengthy process. Typically, if you're a big company like, I don't know, I'm going to pick on a pipeline company like Williams. Okay, they will have an entire staff dedicated to writing these applications and that sort of thing, because it's not trivial. This isn't just something you can do in your spare time. Okay, there's a lot of work that goes into this. Okay, to write these resource reports, they provide guidance. So this is from FERC on how to write these resource reports. Okay, and so there's how many bullet points here? There's seven bullet points, okay, that you have to make sure that you hit. So when you are writing your environmental impact statement for this hydrogen pipeline, you need to make sure that you are doing this. Now, in the homework assignment, I have a simplified version of these bullet points. I'm not going to make you write all 7 of these, right? I don't want you don't have to provide evidence of agency consultation. Okay, don't worry about that. But I will give you, I think it's like 4 bullet points that you have to hit. Okay, so that's basically how you go about persuading a federal government agency that what you're doing is necessary and safe, so that they'll say, okay, we will sign off on that. All right. Now, on the flip side, stakeholder engagement is a very different ballgame. Okay, so a stakeholder is basically anybody who could be affected or is interested in planning, construction, or operation of a project. Okay, now that's a FERC definition, and so you have to make sure you're doing that. And so there's a long list of people who can and should be part of the process. And so, again, if you're like a large pipeline company, you are going to have a dedicated staff for doing stakeholder engagement, because it's not sufficient just to engage with all these groups at the beginning of the project and then say, all right, we've engaged with these groups, check, let's move on. You have to be continually in touch with these people to show that you value their engagement, you want them to be involved, you want them to be engaged, okay? So it's a continual process throughout the operation of the project. Now, there's a couple of good documents that provide background and best practices for how to do community engagement. This one is put out by FERC, and it's a little dated at this point. It's from 2015, but This is kind of their most recent suggested best practices manual. And then the other one, which I find particularly useful in the context of pipelines, is this one, which is from the American Petroleum Institute from back in 2020. And so we'll go through a couple of the key points here so you guys have an understanding of how you're going to go about writing this op-ed. Okay, so FERC has 4 main elements of stakeholder outreach. So first of all, you have to make sure that the upper management in your company is committed to this, because if that's not the case, the whole thing is going to fall apart because of lack of trust in your organization. Okay, so that's a key thing. You need to make sure basically that you internally have your act together. Okay, you want to make sure you're speaking with a unified voice when you, the company, goes out and engages with the community. Okay. You want to make sure that you are properly educating the stakeholders on what's going to happen. That's a big part of it. A lot of opposition to infrastructure projects comes because, not because there's necessarily anything bad with it, but it's because people are unfamiliar with it. Okay. And, you know, if you're unfamiliar with something, you're typically not going to allow that to happen on your property, right? So having good education of stakeholders is very important. And then make sure you track who you've talked to, what their concerns are, how you can come back to them and say, hey, I remember you had this concern. Here's how we can alleviate that, okay? Make sure that you're keeping track of everything that's going on. So you have, again, it's about presenting a good unified effort here. The API on the has another way to think about doing this, and it's called the Plan, Do, Check, Act strategy. And you start off with the planning. Okay, so this is about how are you going to go about your risk assessment and community engagement, and then you're going to do it. Okay, do your community engagement. You're going to check to make sure that you've got good lessons learned. And then you are going to repeat the process after some internal reflection. So this is all about risk assessment, engaging the community, and they review it as a continuous process that keeps going around in this circle. So that's kind of another way of thinking about it. Okay, so now about the specific messages that you want to convey to your stakeholders. This is out of the API manual. There's a couple of things you want to keep in mind. So the first one is that you might have different groups that you give specific messages to. So you need to think about how you're going to do that. And the really helpful thing here is that you probably want to start out with maybe some focus groups or something like that, so you understand what are the main concerns that you're going to have to confront from the get-go, and think about how you can properly message to address those concerns. And then there's kind of the continuous learning aspect down here. As you learn more about the community and the different concerns, you can adjust how those messages are delivered. Okay, but the 2 things you want to keep in mind, there's 2 characteristics of good communication. So they have to be clear and concise. Okay, don't use big words, don't use too many words. Keep it short, keep it understandable, something bite-sized that they can remember. Okay, and then this is a really important one. It needs to be credible. Okay, so when you are writing your op-ed, it's important to cite respected authorities like the DOE, non-governmental organizations, peer-reviewed literature, that sort of thing. Basically to show, quote from LeVar Burton in Reading Rainbow. Don't take my word for it. You guys are all. I'm too old. Have any of y'all watched Reading Rainbow? Gee whiz, it's a great show. Okay, but anyway, yeah, you want to convince them from credible authorities outside of just yourself that this project is worthwhile and will bring benefits. Okay, so that's really the key takeaway here. Okay, a helpful way of going about this is to build what's called a message frame. So a message frame, it's a matrix, and we'll go ahead and put one together in a minute, that it allows you to think about the different, proponents and opponents of your project and what they would say to each other and what they would say about each other, so that you can try to kind of alleviate some of that conflict. And yeah, like I said, you anticipate the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities in particular to engage with these groups. And so the way a message frame works is it's got these 4 boxes here. And so in the top left, we'll have things that supporters will typically say in support of your project. And on the top right, you would have, they're kind of using the euphemism concerned stakeholders, but these would be people who are maybe not supportive of what you're doing. And these are what they would say about your project. So that's the top row. And then on the bottom row is kind of the cross thread there. So bottom left, these are concerned stakeholders are saying about supporters. And then bottom right is what supporters are saying against concerned stakeholders. So this is an example from the API publication. They are imagining a statewide tax on plastic bags. Okay, so the people who are supportive of this say, yeah, it's a big part of the litter and it's bad for the environment. It's bad for tourism because people see plastic bags and it looks gross. And we can use the revenue to do things like renovate parks and that sort of thing. Whereas the concerned stakeholders are saying, plastic bags aren't even, such a big deal in terms of overall litter, and taxes are bad because they take money away from people and disproportionately affect, for example, working families and senior citizens. And, reusable plastic bags are gross because people don't wash them enough. So those are kind of the two, the proponents and the opponents. And then what's really interesting is what you envision these two groups, or maybe you've actually done some community engagement, what they're saying each other. So, even if you ban plastic bags, you're not making a big impact on litter and waste. Whereas the supporters might say, using less plastic is always a good thing, even if plastic bags aren't a big problem. Okay, so you can imagine putting this together, such a matrix together for any type of project. And so I've actually gone ahead and done an example for you guys here. And it's not required that you do a message frame for your homework assignment, but it can be helpful because it can help you kind of think about what the arguments are that you might have to counter, okay? So here's the example that I did a message frame for. So ethanol plants in Iowa emit a lot of carbon dioxide. And ethanol is very important to the local economy because, well, there's a number of reasons, but a lot of people grow corn there, and getting money from turning it into ethanol is a big source of income for them. So there's a big incentive to continue generating ethanol, but to decarbonize it. And so several companies have proposed carbon capture and storage solutions for the ethanol plants. And that involves capturing the CO2 at the plant and then moving it by pipeline to places where it can be stored. And so the main places that people are looking at are the Mount Simon sandstone. This is if you remember back to our CCUS group project, this is the Illinois Basin site that's run by ADM. And then the other one is a proposed storage site up here in North Dakota. Okay, so if constructed as proposed, there's going to be a lot of pipelines in Iowa. And so there's people who say, hey, this is great. We need these pipelines because we want to reduce the carbon footprint of ethanol production. But people who are in opposition to these pipelines say, pipelines can be leaky. CO2 is a problematic gas because it's denser than air. And so if you have a pipeline leak, it'll stay at ground level, and that can be hazardous to people's health. There's always the concern about property damage during the construction phase. And then there's concern, especially for the North Dakota end of this, that, you know, we're just going to use the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery and just produce more carbon emissions. So that's kind of a very simplistic view of what's going on there, but we can use that to construct a message frame here. So, you know, we've got 3 bullet points that the supporters are saying, you know, basically CO2 is bad, ethanol and fertilizer are good, and we should keep doing them. And, you know, we might have spare pipeline capacity that other industries can use for decarbonization. Whereas the opponents are saying CO2 pipelines are dangerous, they'll be used for EOR and ethanol production and just increase the lifetime of those polluting industries. And you're not taking landowner concerns seriously, okay? So then, you know, those, you know, the things that those groups would say to each other. So the opponents would say, you know, it's better just to scrap all this and do low carbon industry than to try to capture and store the CO2 from legacy industries. Ethanol industrial agriculture in general are damaging to the environment because they, you know, use chemicals and destroy the topsoil and all that stuff. And then, you know, the pipeline companies have spent too much money lobbying good state government officials. Okay. Now, I'm not making these up. Okay. I actually Googled like local newspaper reports and op-eds and stuff, and this is what people actually do say. And then the supporters would counter that by saying, you know, there have been 0 deaths in the last 2 decades associated with CO2 pipelines in the US, so they're very safe. Ethanol and agriculture are critical to the US economy, and the CO2 is not going to be used for enhanced oil recovery because there's less favorable carbon tax credits, and also, you know, this isn't where a lot of oil and gas production is. The Williston Basin is over here, so it's not even going there. And then, you know, the companies do have compensation plans in case of, you know, property damage. So it's not like they're not, you know, listening to landowner concerns. So anyway, that is a very brief way of putting together your message frame and coming up with a strategy for countering concerns. Okay, so like I said, this the homework is not due for 2 weeks, so you have plenty of time to think about it. And hopefully it shouldn't take you too long to do. Question?
Slides posted.
Yes, I just put them up this morning. Other questions? Okay, fantastic. All right, well, let's get back to a little bit of methane emissions. All right. Okay, so we were talking about sources of methane emissions around the world. And I want to focus in here on the United States because it kind of shows you what the low-hanging fruit is in terms of mitigating methane emissions. So, you know, methane emissions in general are often referred to as the low-hanging fruit in terms of limiting climate change, just because it's, you know, it has such a strong, greenhouse gas, and we know what a lot of the leakage sources are, so we can work on trying to alleviate that. So in the United States, this is an estimate from 2018, but of the total methane emitted, about 25% of it is from natural gas production, and then another 25% is from enteric fermentation, which again, that is cows digesting. And so there's also some amount from petroleum and then some amount from coal mining. So, you know, if we can make a bite or make a dent in these, you know, energy-related methane emissions, that can go a long way towards reducing the overall methane footprint of the US. So if we look at oil and gas production, there's different places where methane might be emitted. So there's some that are actually intentional sources. So flaring, we talked about that. If you have incomplete combustion, you'll have some methane coming out. There are certain pneumatic devices that whenever they operate, they always emit a little bit of methane. Now, a lot of those are being phased out, actually, but some older facilities out there still have these. During well completion, it's not common to have methane be emitted from the wellhead until you get everything sealed up. And then if you have a well that's been shut in, there's a process called blowing down or blow down, where you release some of the pressure just to prevent the pressure from building up too much. And that necessarily involves the release of methane because that's what's building up the pressure. So those are some things that, intentionally happen that are sources of methane. But then there's what we call fugitive emissions. And these are, basically leaks that we're not trying to emit the methane, but it comes out anyway. And these often happen at things like pipe connections, valves, and storage tanks. So if you look at the kind of entire natural gas supply chain, you've got well sites and storage facilities in the field, which can be sources of leakage. The field is typically connected to a central gathering unit, which will have compressors and other equipment there that is also sources of leaks. The processing plants also will have those. And then anywhere along the pipeline, you've got compressors that are required to maintain the pressure in the pipeline. Those can be leaky. You can have storage facilities, which will also sometimes have leaks. And then when you're actually getting to the end user, there are going to be pipelines and compressors and things like that, which again are sources of leaks. So there's a lot of places from the wellhead to the end user where methane can be leaky. And so if you look at where those places are, you can get a sense of how you can mitigate them. So this is a very typical simplified diagram of a separation facility. So this would be something that you have on an oil well where you're producing oil, gas, and water, and you need to separate out those three things. So you'll have your well here, and then the fluids coming out here will go through what's called a line heater, and this just makes everything easier to separate when it's at a higher temperature. And then you've got a two-phase separator, which separates out the gases from the liquids. And then the gases go into the gas line. You have another three-phase separator, which separates gas, oil, and water. And then those three phases go through different processing steps. But more gas goes through a compressor to the gas pipeline. You have an emulsion treater for the oil, more gas comes out. And then you have an oil tank, and more gas will come out of the oil tank as it comes out of solution. So there's a lot of places here where gas has to be collected, run through a compressor, and then sent to the pipeline. So all of these places are situations where you could have leakage of methane that you could try to mitigate. Okay, so here's a typical compressor station. It's fun sometimes if you're driving on I-10 between San Antonio and Houston, you see big trucks carrying these things, and you're like, what the heck is that? And it's a compressor. So now you know. But these are necessary along pipelines to keep the pressure up because the pressure, inevitably falls as you move downstream. So these have a lot of parts in them that can be sources of leaks. I mean, anywhere you've got pipe connections or anything, there's a lot of places here that could be leaky. Another one at the well site are these storage tanks, and these are used to store either oil or water, but they can also have gas leaks, especially if gas comes out of the oil. The oil tanks are usually made of welded steel, and so there's also opportunity for leakage there, whereas the water tanks are made out of fiberglass. So you often have very leaky tanks, and some older tanks can be big sources of methane. Okay, I think let's stop there for today, and hopefully we can finish this up on Wednesday, but I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Monday. I'll see you back here.